When Camila sat me down that evening, it felt calculated from the start. Her demeanor was almost too polished, her words too rehearsed. She held her wine glass like it was a prop, twirling it between sentences with the confidence of someone who believed she was in complete control of the conversation. She began with pleasantries, something vague about how relationships evolve and people change. Then came the shift. She leaned back, her tone sharper, and started outlining her needs. Apparently, she had decided that she needed space to explore. Not because of me, of course, this was about her. A personal journey, she called it. She framed it as temporary, a necessary step to becoming a better partner. The entitlement in her words was staggering. She wasn't asking, she was informing me. She even threw in how lucky I was that she was being honest about it, as if her transparency absolved her of any wrongdoing. I listened quietly, masking my anger under a neutral expression. She seemed relieved, maybe even smug, as if my silence meant agreement. She touched my hand lightly, signaling the discussion was over, confident that I was on board. What Camila didn't know, what she couldn't even fathom, was that I understood far more than she gave me credit for. And while she thought she'd won, all I needed was time to set things in motion. Camila wasted no time putting her plan into action. Within days, her schedule became noticeably erratic. She started coming home late, always armed with excuses. Work ran over, drinks with the girls, traffic delays. Each time, her tone was dismissive, as if explaining herself was a chore. Her phone was glued to her hand now, a near-constant presence. She'd scroll and type furiously, lips curling into faint smirks, and when I asked casually what had her so engaged, her replies were vague and impatient. Just chatting, she'd say, without looking up. Her growing arrogance was impossible to ignore. She strutted around the house like she'd achieved some sort of moral high ground for being honest with me. She even had the nerve to call herself brave once. Brave, for telling me she needed to explore. But the arrogance worked to my advantage. She wasn't subtle. She didn't feel the need to be. It was almost insulting how easily she assumed I was buying her lies. She thought I was too oblivious, too weak to question her. What she didn't realize was that I was already several steps ahead. The night she first laid out her grand plan, I started mine. While she thought I was going along with her fantasy, I was quietly gathering tools, software to clone her phone, hidden cameras for the house, and a journal to document every inconsistency. For now, I played my role. I asked just enough questions to seem curious, but not suspicious. I nodded when she offered flimsy explanations. Let her think I was too trusting to notice the cracks forming in her stories. I even told her to enjoy herself when she left the house, earning a satisfied smile from her as she disappeared out the door. Inside, though, I was simmering. Watching her parade her deceit through our home only fueled my resolve. Camila's lies grew bolder as time went on. She was testing boundaries, seeing how much she could get away with before I cracked. But I didn't give her the satisfaction. One evening, she came home unusually late. Her explanation was almost laughable. Something about a work meeting that ran long at a downtown restaurant. She still smelled faintly of wine and expensive cologne that wasn't hers. I didn't press her, just nodded and said, "Rough day?" She shot me a smug grin, clearly mistaking my restraint for indifference. The next morning, I checked the feed from one of the cameras I'd installed in the living room. Sure enough, while I'd been at work, a man had been in our house. He'd stayed for over an hour, seated comfortably on the couch, laughing with Camila like they were in their own little world. Later that day, I cloned her phone for the first time. It took longer than I expected, but the payoff was worth it. Her texts were a goldmine of arrogance and betrayal. She'd been messaging this man for weeks, maybe longer. The tone was flirty, casual, and utterly disrespectful toward me. "Patrick's so clueless," she'd written in one message. "He doesn't ask questions anymore. I think he's afraid of rocking the boat." Another message detailed her plans to see him again later in the week. She even joked about how easy it was to manage me. I stared at those words for a long time, letting them sink in. She thought I was a joke, a pushover, someone to pity. It hurt, of course it did, but the anger was stronger. Every smug text, every smug smile she gave me when I asked about her day, it all added fuel to the fire. I didn't confront her. Not yet. There was no point in tipping my hand until I had every piece of evidence I needed. Camila's arrogance had reached new heights. She walked through the house with a sense of triumph, as if she'd won some unspoken battle. Every new excuse she offered me was delivered with even less effort than the last, like she was daring me to call her out. She'd started dressing differently, too. Subtle at first, new tops, shoes that seemed more suited for a night out than an office. Then the changes became more obvious. Dresses I'd never seen before, ones that hugged her figure a little too closely. She wore perfume she hadn't used in years, the kind she knew I liked, but now it wasn't for me. One Saturday, she claimed she had errands to run. I offered to come along, but she quickly brushed me off, saying it was just boring stuff. After she left, I checked the camera feed. Instead of heading to the usual places, she met someone in a parking lot 2 towns over. I couldn't see his face clearly, but their interaction was unmistakable. She leaned into his car, laughing, before climbing into the passenger seat and driving off with him. That evening, I decided to test the waters. Over dinner, I casually mentioned her day. "Get everything done?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She barely looked up from her plate. "Yeah, just some shopping and returns," she said, her voice laced with impatience. Her phone buzzed on the table, and she snatched it up immediately, smiling at the screen. I pretended not to notice, focusing on my food while she typed out a reply. "Anything interesting?" I asked after a moment, still keeping my tone casual. She glanced at me, a flicker of irritation crossing her face. "Just work stuff," she said, sliding the phone face down on the table. Her lies were becoming so casual, so practiced, that it was almost insulting. But I didn't let it show. I simply nodded, as though I believed every word. Internally, though, I was cataloging everything. Her excuses, her behavior, her growing carelessness. She thought she was untouchable, and that was her biggest mistake. Camila's confidence was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it made her reckless. She didn't hide her lies as carefully as she should have, giving me all the evidence I needed. On the other hand, her blatant disregard for me was infuriating. One Wednesday evening, she announced she'd be working late. "We have a client deadline," she said, barely pausing as she grabbed her bag and headed for the door. She didn't even wait for my response, clearly assuming I'd accept the excuse without question. Instead of sitting at home, I decided to follow her. I'd already placed a tracker in her car, so I pulled up the app and watched as her location updated in real time. She wasn't heading toward the office. Her car stopped at a trendy bar on the other side of town, a place we'd never been to together. I parked nearby and waited, my heart pounding as I watched her walk in, her head held high. 30 minutes later, she emerged with a man. He was tall, well-dressed, and way too comfortable with my wife. They shared a laugh before walking to his car, where she climbed into the passenger seat. They didn't drive far, just to a nearby boutique hotel. I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. Watching her disappear into that hotel felt like a punch to the gut. But it also solidified something in me. This wasn't just a fling. It wasn't a phase. She was methodically dismantling our marriage, piece by piece, and she didn't even care enough to be discreet about it. That night, I didn't confront her. Instead, I logged every detail: the time, the location, the hotel's name. I drove home, emptied the hidden cameras, and reviewed the footage. It confirmed what I already knew. She'd been using our home as her playground for weeks. The anger I felt wasn't just for her betrayal, but for the sheer audacity of it all. She thought she'd beaten me, thought I was too clueless or too scared to act. She had no idea the storm that was coming. The hotel visit changed something in me. Up until that point, I'd been gathering evidence, quietly piecing together the puzzle of her betrayal. But now I wanted to make sure Camila felt the consequences of every lie, every selfish choice. The next morning, she acted like nothing had happened. She smiled at me over breakfast, humming as she buttered her toast. I played along, nodding at her casual small talk, but inside, I was already planning my next move. When she left for work, I dove into her phone. Her messages from the night before were as bold as ever. She'd texted her lover on her way home, thanking him for the perfect night and joking about how easy it was to manage me. She even mentioned my name, calling me predictable. Predictable. I clenched my fists, taking a deep breath to calm myself. Her carelessness would be her undoing. By the weekend, I'd placed trackers on her phone and car, installed more cameras, and backed up all her messages. I even set up a shared cloud account to archive every piece of evidence, from photos to emails. Saturday evening, she claimed she was heading to a work dinner. She dressed up, her makeup flawless, her outfit far more suited for a date than a professional meeting. I watched her leave, smiling faintly as she walked out the door. The tracker showed her driving to a nearby restaurant, where she met the same man from the hotel. They lingered in the parking lot before walking in together, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. I didn't follow this time. Instead, I went to her closet and searched for anything incriminating. It didn't take long to find a second phone, hidden in an old shoebox. The messages on it were worse than I expected. Explicit photos, detailed plans for future rendezvous, even messages mocking me with her lover. It stung, but it also fueled my determination. Every new piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin of her arrogance. She thought she had the upper hand, but she was playing right into mine. By the time Camila returned from her work dinner, I had already gone through every inch of her second phone. The messages were worse than I expected. She didn't just mock me to her lover. She bragged about how easy it was to manipulate me. "He'll never leave," one message read. "Patrick's the perfect safety net. I can have my fun and still have a loyal husband waiting at home." Another message described her plans to use my predictability to maintain her cover. "He doesn't ask questions anymore," she'd told him. "I don't even have to try." The arrogance of it all was sickening, but I didn't confront her. Not yet. When she walked through the door that night, she wore the same smug expression I'd grown to despise. She greeted me casually, tossed her bag onto the counter, and poured herself a glass of wine. "Long day," she sighed, as if she expected sympathy. I nodded, keeping my face neutral, and asked how the dinner went. She gave me a vague answer about a client presentation and how everyone stayed late to discuss numbers. She even added a half-hearted yawn for effect. Her confidence was almost laughable. If only she knew what I'd uncovered just hours earlier. The next day, while she was at work, I started organizing my findings. I printed screenshots of her messages and photos, creating a folder of evidence. I backed up every video from the cameras and even saved GPS logs from her car. I wanted to ensure that when the time came, there wouldn't be a shred of doubt about her betrayal. I also reached out to a lawyer, a good one. I explained the situation and handed over the folder of evidence. "We can make this work to your advantage," he said, flipping through the damning materials. "But patience will be key. Let her dig her own grave." Patience. That was the hardest part. Every day, I had to sit across from her at dinner, listening to her lies, pretending I didn't know what she was really up to. But it was worth it. With every smug smile she gave me, I reminded myself that her reckoning was coming, and it was going to be devastating. Camila's boldness grew with every passing week. It was as if lying to me had become second nature to her. She no longer bothered with creative excuses. She didn't see the point. She thought I'd stopped paying attention. One Friday night, she came home particularly late. Her hair was disheveled, and her makeup, usually flawless, looked hastily retouched. She mentioned traffic and mumbled something about drinks with coworkers before disappearing upstairs to shower. As I listened to the water running, I checked the camera feed from earlier in the evening. There she was sitting in our living room with her lover. They were too comfortable, too familiar, laughing and leaning in close. The sight of another man casually lounging on my couch, acting like he belonged there, churned my stomach. She had left with him shortly after, heading back to the same boutique hotel they'd frequented before. Her pattern was becoming predictable, almost routine. When she returned to the kitchen after her shower, she seemed relaxed, even cheerful. She grabbed a glass of water and asked about my day, like nothing had happened. "It was fine," I replied, matching her casual tone. "How was yours?" She shrugged. "Busy. You know how it is." Her lies were so brazen, they almost didn't seem real. I wondered if she even realized how much contempt was dripping from her words. That night, after she went to bed, I combed through the evening's footage again, documenting every detail. I'd learned by now that my anger was best channeled into action. Watching her blatant disregard for me, for our marriage, only strengthened my resolve. I started expanding my plan. It wasn't enough to have evidence. I needed to ensure that when the truth came out, it would ruin her carefully constructed world. Her lover wasn't just anyone. He had a wife, and I knew that exposing their affair would have consequences far beyond our marriage. So I began gathering information on him, too. His wife deserved to know, and when the time was right, I would make sure she did. Camila's confidence, or was it sheer obliviousness, knew no bounds. Day after day, she maintained the same smug routine, vague excuses, flimsy alibis, and those insufferable smiles that made it clear she thought I was completely clueless. Each lie she told felt more like a test, as if she wanted to see how far she could push me before I cracked. But I didn't crack. I played my part perfectly, nodding at her excuses and offering neutral replies while quietly building my case. By now, I had a complete dossier on Victor, the man she was willing to throw everything away for. Victor's online persona was the epitome of hypocrisy. His social media accounts were filled with photos of family vacations, captions celebrating his wedding anniversary, and posts about the joys of fatherhood. He came across as the picture-perfect family man, the type who'd never miss a soccer game or forget his wife's birthday. But behind that polished exterior was a man who had no issue meeting my wife in hotel rooms while his kids played in the backyard. When I decided to contact his wife, Emily, it wasn't an easy choice. I knew this would blow up their lives, and part of me wondered if it was my place to get involved. But as I stared at the evidence I'd gathered, the smug texts and the mocking words Camila and Victor had exchanged, I knew I couldn't stay silent. Emily deserved the truth. I sent an anonymous email to her with screenshots of messages between Victor and Camila. The photos weren't explicit, just enough to leave no doubt about what had been happening. I crafted the email carefully, keeping it factual and unemotional. This wasn't about revenge for her. It was about arming her with the truth. Emily replied within hours. Her disbelief was palpable even through the screen. "Thank you for this," she wrote. "I don't know what to say. I'll handle it." I didn't reply. Whatever confrontation followed would be between her and Victor. I had my own battle to fight. Meanwhile, Camila carried on like nothing had changed. She claimed she had to attend a late meeting at Victor's house because, apparently, his home office was better suited for whatever excuse she concocted. The audacity was staggering. I nodded along as if her story made perfect sense, told her to have a productive evening, and even managed a faint smile as she walked out the door. What she didn't know was that I was tracking her every move. The GPS in her car showed she went directly to Victor's house, where she stayed for hours. I didn't need to follow. At this point, I already had all the proof I needed to bring her lies crashing down. The next morning, something shifted. Camila wasn't her usual smug self. She was unusually quiet, clutching her phone like a lifeline as she paced the kitchen. Her eyes darted to me occasionally, but the confidence that once lit her gaze was gone, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. She tried to maintain her facade, making idle conversation about her plans for the weekend, something vague about meeting friends. But her tone was off. The smug edge I'd grown used to was absent, replaced by something almost apologetic. I suspected Emily had confronted Victor, and whatever fallout occurred was now bleeding into Camila's world. I could imagine the heated argument, Victor scrambling for excuses while Emily dismantled his carefully constructed lies. And Camila? She was likely realizing, too late, that her perfect arrangement wasn't so perfect anymore. Her lies were starting to unravel, and she knew it. But as I watched her try to salvage her composure, I couldn't help but feel a grim sense of satisfaction. Camila still thought she could navigate her way out of this mess, but she had no idea how far ahead of her I was. The worst was yet to come, and I was going to make sure she felt every bit of it. Camila's unease was subtle at first. She tried to maintain her usual demeanor, but there were cracks in her performance. Her phone was never out of reach now, and she glanced at it constantly, as if waiting for bad news. When she thought I wasn't looking, her expression would tighten, and she'd chew her lip, a nervous habit I hadn't seen in years. I suspected her lover's life was imploding, and I couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. Emily was no doubt handling things on her end, and judging by Camila's sudden shift, it wasn't going smoothly. The following weekend, she told me she'd be going to a friend's birthday party. The lie was so thin, I almost laughed. She left the house in a rush, dressed to impress, and drove off without so much as a goodbye. I checked the tracker. Her car headed toward the same hotel she'd used before. This time, though, the stop was brief, no more than 20 minutes. Then she drove aimlessly for a while, circling through different neighborhoods before finally parking at a coffee shop downtown. I decided to follow. When I arrived, I saw her sitting alone at a corner table, staring blankly at her phone. She looked frazzled, her confident aura nowhere to be seen. She wasn't texting or scrolling, just holding the device like a lifeline. I stayed outside, watching from a distance. She sat there for over an hour, occasionally sipping her drink, but otherwise motionless. Whatever was happening, it was clear she was unraveling. That night, she came home earlier than expected. Her smile was forced, her attempts at conversation strained. She even asked me about my day, which was out of character, given how self-absorbed she'd become. "Everything okay?" I asked, feigning concern. She hesitated, then nodded quickly. "Of course. Just tired." I let it drop, knowing she wouldn't tell me the truth. But her discomfort was telling. She was feeling the pressure, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. In the meantime, I continued refining my plan. My lawyer had advised patience, and I intended to follow through. Camila thought she still had control, but her world was hanging by a thread, and I was ready to cut it. Camila's unraveling became more pronounced over the next few days. She was distracted, jittery even, and seemed unsure of herself in ways I hadn't seen before. Her confidence had always been her weapon, the thing she wielded to keep me in line. Now it was slipping through her fingers. She made a weak attempt to act normal. She asked about dinner plans, mentioned a work project, and even offered to watch a movie with me one evening. It was a stark contrast to her recent behavior, and it only made her desperation more obvious. I decided to test her. One evening after dinner, I casually asked if she wanted to invite some friends over for drinks. She hesitated, her expression tightening just enough for me to notice. "Maybe another time," she said, forcing a smile. "Things are just really busy right now." Busy with what? I wondered. Her lies were becoming more transparent by the day. That night, after she went to bed, I checked her second phone again. There were fewer messages now, and the tone of them had shifted. Her lover seemed panicked, his text short and terse. "We need to talk," one read. "Not like this." Another message from Camila was more telling. "This is getting out of control. Are you handling it?" Handling what, exactly? I could only imagine what kind of chaos Emily had unleashed on Victor. Whatever it was working. The next day, I found a note on the kitchen counter. Camila had left early, claiming she had a meeting and wouldn't be back until late. I knew better. I checked the tracker as soon as she left. She didn't go to the office. Instead, she drove to a park on the edge of town and parked in a secluded area. Victor's car was already there. I watched from a distance as they argued, their gestures animated and sharp. She looked frantic, while he seemed defensive, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. They stayed there for nearly an hour before going their separate ways. Camila's drive home was erratic, the tracker showing several stops along the way. By the time she walked through the door, she looked exhausted, her usual composure replaced by a strained expression. "How was your day?" I asked casually, masking my satisfaction. She gave a weak smile and muttered something about it being long, then disappeared upstairs without another word. I didn't press her. I didn't need to. She was unraveling, and soon, there wouldn't be anything left for her to hold on to. The cracks in Camila's armor were widening, and she was barely keeping herself together. Her once meticulously planned lies were becoming sloppy, her stories riddled with inconsistencies. It was almost sad to watch, almost. The following weekend, she announced she was going to visit her sister. She didn't bother with details, just threw a bag together and left, avoiding eye contact as she said goodbye. I waited until her car was out of sight before pulling up the tracker. She wasn't heading to her sister's. Instead, she was driving out of town toward a private retreat house I recognized from an earlier message exchange with Victor. Rather than follow her, I focused on the final stages of my plan. Her recklessness was working in my favor, giving me all the ammunition I needed. While she was away, I went through the footage from the cameras one last time, organizing it into folders for easy reference. I reviewed messages, photos, and videos, ensuring every piece of evidence was airtight. The sheer volume of it was staggering. A digital timeline of her lies and betrayals, each more brazen than the last. I also reached out to Emily again. Her response was swift and decisive. Victor had been served divorce papers, and his life was unraveling at an impressive pace. She thanked me for the information, adding that Camila's name had come up during their confrontation. "She'll get what's coming to her," Emily wrote. I couldn't argue with that. When Camila returned late Sunday evening, she looked worn out, her usual confidence replaced by visible anxiety. She dropped her bag by the door and mumbled something about being tired before heading upstairs. Her behavior didn't surprise me. Whatever plans she and Victor had made were clearly falling apart, and the strain was showing. She hadn't even bothered to come up with an excuse for why she'd returned so late. I spent the rest of the night preparing. The evidence was ready, the lawyer briefed, and the timeline set. Camila thought she was untouchable, but her world was about to come crashing down, and this time, there would be no escaping the consequences. Monday morning arrived, and Camila acted like nothing was amiss. She moved through the house with an air of forced normalcy, making idle conversation and even asking if I needed anything before she left for work. It was almost laughable, this sudden attempt to play the dutiful wife. As soon as she left, I set the final pieces of my plan into motion. I sent a package of evidence to her employer, detailing her extracurricular activities with Victor. The firm's strict policy on professional conduct guaranteed this would end her career there. Next, I sent an anonymous email to her closest circle of friends. It included selected screenshots of her messages and photos, enough to make it clear that Camila wasn't the person they thought she was. Finally, I reached out to our financial advisor to ensure all joint accounts were secured in my name. Over the past few months, I had quietly drained the majority of our shared funds into a separate account, leaving just enough to maintain appearances. By the time Camila returned that evening, the wheels were already in motion. She walked through the door with a strained smile, trying to appear casual, but her discomfort was evident. "How was your day?" she asked, almost nervously. "Productive," I replied, keeping my tone light. She nodded, her eyes darting around the room like she was searching for something out of place. I could tell she felt the shift, even if she didn't understand it yet. That night, I checked the tracker on her car again. She hadn't gone directly to work that day, but had made a brief stop at Victor's house. I wondered if she was trying to salvage what was left of their arrangement, or if she was starting to panic about the fallout. Either way, it didn't matter. Her lies had caught up with her, and she was about to realize just how much damage she'd done. To me, to herself, and to everything she thought she had control over. The storm hit Camila the next morning. She left the house as usual, but by mid-morning, I received a call from my lawyer. Her employer acted quickly, he said. "She's been terminated." The HR team confirmed they received the evidence and won't tolerate conduct that puts the firm's reputation at risk. "It's a clean cut, effective immediately." I thanked him, already picturing the fallout. Camila prided herself on her professional image, and losing her job would shatter the carefully curated persona she flaunted to everyone around her. Later that day, the text began. Her friends, at least the ones who hadn't already distanced themselves, were reaching out to her, questioning the screenshots they'd received. The group chat she'd once dominated with her self-assured commentary was now filled with cold silence or outright accusations. When Camila returned home that evening, she looked pale and frazzled. She dropped her bag by the door and went straight to the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine without saying a word. "You okay?" I asked, feigning concern. She froze for a moment, then nodded. "Just a tough day at work," she muttered. I nearly laughed at her audacity. Her lies were so transparent now, they almost didn't feel like lies at all, just desperate attempts to cling to the illusion of control. As the evening wore on, her phone buzzed constantly. She ignored most of the messages, but her tense posture and the way she gripped the glass in her hand said it all. The walls were closing in, and she knew it. Before bed, I checked her second phone again. The messages from Victor had all but stopped. His last text was brief and final. "This is over. Don't contact me again." I stared at the words for a long moment, letting them sink in. The man she'd risked everything for had cut her loose, leaving her to deal with the wreckage alone. Her empire of lies was crumbling, and soon, she'd have no one left to turn to. The next morning, Camila's unraveling was impossible to hide. She barely spoke, pacing the kitchen with her phone in hand, eyes darting nervously to the screen every few seconds. It was almost satisfying to watch. By the time I returned home that evening, she was waiting for me in the living room, her expression a mix of panic and forced composure. "We need to talk," she said, her voice trembling slightly. I sat down across from her, feigning curiosity. "There's been a misunderstanding," she began, fumbling for the right words. "Some things have come up at work, and I might need to take some time off. It's nothing serious, just complicated." I said nothing, letting her twist herself into knots trying to explain. "And there's been some rumors," she added, her voice growing quieter. "About me, from people who don't understand the full picture." It was the most half-hearted excuse I'd ever heard. She was grasping at straws, trying to salvage what little dignity she thought she had left. "Is that so?" I finally said, keeping my tone neutral. Her eyes searched mine, looking for some hint of my reaction, but I gave her nothing. She stammered for a moment longer before trailing off, the weight of the silence crushing her confidence. The next day, I delivered the final blow. While she was out, probably trying to clean up the mess she'd made, I had the locks changed and her belongings packed into boxes. When she returned, she found the note I'd left on the kitchen counter. "Camila, your lies and betrayal have destroyed any trust we once had. The evidence is irrefutable, and the damage you've caused is irreversible. The divorce papers are filed. I suggest you find somewhere else to stay tonight. The house is mine, and so is everything else you thought you'd keep. You wanted freedom. Now you have it. Patrick." Her texts and calls came in rapid fire after that, ranging from tearful apologies to angry demands. I ignored them all. Over the next few weeks, I watched from a distance as Camila's life completely unraveled. She lost her job, her social circle, and her lover all in one swift motion. The woman who had once strutted around with smug confidence was now a shadow of herself, reduced to scrambling for scraps of the life she'd thrown away. As for me, I moved on. I thrived. The weight of her manipulations lifted, and for the first time in years, I felt free. I saw her once, months later, at a coffee shop. She didn't see me, and I didn't approach her. She looked tired, worn down, like someone who had learned too late that actions have consequences. I walked out without a word, leaving her to whatever life she'd built for herself. She wanted freedom, and she got it, but not the way she expected. And I didn't regret a single thing.